Hello, everyone. Welcome to Spark Animation 2020. I'm Jennifer Wolfe, writer and journalist, and I'm here today to speak with Pieter Coudyzer, the director and writer of The Passerby, De Passant. Pieter, can you please say hello and tell us how to really say your name?
Hi, my name is pronounced Pieter Coudyzer.
Pieter, thank you for joining us today, and we're really pleased to talk about your very lovely film. I understand it was roughly 2 years in the making.
Yes, more or less, yeah.
And we'd love to sit here today and delve into how this film was brought to life. But starting out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born and where you've studied.
Yes, I was born in Ghent, Belgium. I studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Ghent, studied animation there for 4 years. Graduated in 2003, so a long time ago. And I made a couple of short films since then, a lot actually, and also a graphic novel. And so that's it.
Terrific. And let's talk about De Passant. So tell us a little bit about the genesis of the film. Why did you decide to tell this story and in this medium?
Well, actually, De Passant is based on something that I saw when I was about, I think, 15 years old. We lived at a very busy street, and back in those days, you walked alone to the school. I walked out of the house, and just in front of my face, I saw, a young kid being run over by a car. Mm. So, of course, this, as a young boy, this really had a big impact on me. But what was actually maybe even more impactful was the fact that when I just turned the corner, I realized that life just continues. Like, it doesn't stop because there's this big tragedy or something terrible that you saw, and that always stayed with me. This idea of death and tragedy, and on the other hand, just normal life continuing. And so, yeah, it took me 20 years, I guess, to find the right form, I guess, to make this film. So the idea to shoot it in one continuous take popped into my head, and I said, okay, now I have to make this film in this particular way. And well, it is an animated film. It's kind of a realistic animated film, but I think that animation kind of, how shall I put it? I think there's a kind of a tension between the medium of animation and the realism of the story. It's very difficult to explain, but I felt it needed to be an animated film. Also, of course, in live action, it would be technically very, very difficult. Yeah.
So your film employs cutout animation.
Yes.
And can you tell us why you chose specifically this technique?
Well, it's a technique I've used in all my films because I paint. So all of the backgrounds and all of the characters are painted, then scanned, cut out, and animated in this fashion. We have tried different ways of trying to animate this painted technique in a non-cutout fashion, but it's very difficult. I haven't really found a way to do it. So yeah, that's why it's cut out. It has something very tactile, something very textured. You can do things that are very textured in that particular way of animation. So I like it a lot.
And what was the scripting process like? Did you do storyboards at the same time, or did that part come later?
No, actually, this is the first film I made where I didn't first write a script and then a storyboard. I went straight into an animated storyboard. So because I felt that this was the only way to feel if it would work. Like, I think you can imagine, if you've seen the film, that if you would write it down in words, it would be pretty boring, because the movement, the zoom ins, the zoom outs, all of these things are so crucial to this film that simply writing down what happens would be kind of, it would be a boring read. So I skipped the script phase and went straight to this animatic. And this was the right way, I think, because I just finished the animatic, showed it to my producer, and he was like, "Okay, we need to make this film."
And you mentioned that it was conceived as one long shot, and the film is, nearly, I think, 16 minutes.
Yes.
And so was that challenging?
It was extremely challenging, way more challenging than we were expecting, actually, because what I basically did, I constructed one big file of the entire street, which then had to be imported into After Effects and animated. But the file was so big that each pass from left to right or right to left took about 7 hours to render. And because the file was so big, I couldn't even check in real time if the animation worked. So I would render it out, look at what I had, make a list of all the possible changes, make the changes, and then render it out again to see if it worked. So after each change, I had to wait 7 hours basically to check if it works or not. So it was, extremely, extremely difficult. But yeah.
And for those of you who are watching and maybe haven't had a chance to see the film yet, and you should absolutely watch it, it's gorgeous. So Peter, the action, it takes place on one street.
Yes.
Primarily. And it's a fairly long street, yeah?
It's a fairly long street, yeah. It's about, I think it's 4 minutes to go from one side of the street to the other.
So that's a little bit of a distance, and everything we see and everything we understand about the story comes from what's happening back and forth on this one street. And that's just an amazing framing device. How did you come up with that?
Well, I think I wanted to, like I said, give the impression of life continuing after this tragedy. So you have this character which you believe to be the main character, which is then killed in the middle of the film, and life continues. So that means the camera continues. The camera, as a matter of fact, doesn't stay on the character at the moment of the accident. It just continues on. And another thing is that doing it this way, the foreground becomes the background, and the background becomes the foreground. So the main character becomes a character in the background, and another character takes over as the main character. I thought that was very interesting.
The point of view between the two.
The point of view, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, and yet there's still this sense that we're seeing the story as a third party.
Yes. Yeah. It has kind of a somebody said a documentary kind of feel to it, I guess, which is kind of weird to say in animation, but yes, the eye of the lens of the camera that's you basically. That's the audience basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. So the camera is a very important part of telling the story as well. And you show two very different lives for these main characters,
yes,
who have this intersection. So how did you develop that, these rich lives for each of the characters?
I think it was just a question of mirroring one character with another. So the film has an A-B-A structure. So the A are the characters, and one is you could say, a very introverted character. The other one is an extrovert. So I wanted to mirror it in that kind of way. They cross paths, but completely different lives. The lives intersect visually, but that's the only thing. They don't know each other. They don't get to know each other. There's just kind of a distance between them that I once again wanted to put in the film to accentuate this idea of life continuing. And yeah, but they are mirror images, mirror characters. Let's just put it that way.
So the film was produced at Soil.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about them and that collaboration?
Yeah, Soil is actually a site of an ignored landscape. I think very nice name for a production company. And yes, they when I graduated, the producer actually did a talk at our school, and so I graduated and immediately called him to work on a project that he was doing, which was a project combining short animated films and young up-and-coming poets. So there were pieces of poetry and by 10 or 15 different poets and animators visualizing these poems. So that was a project. I said I wanted to be part of this project. He said okay, and I have been making all my films with him ever since with Soil. So yeah, and they're primarily, they only do animation. They are now starting their first feature film, and yeah, so very exciting.
How many people worked on the film?
I think it was actually not a very big crew. Of course, there's post-production, which is sound, 2 people, a composer, 2 animators, me. So I think about, yeah, a max of 10 people, I think, something like that, including post-production.
And all, working, overlapping over the 2 years that you had the film in production.
Yes.
Was there a pre-production period, a long gestation?
There wasn't actually, like I said, I just made the animatic, the moving storyboard, and everything just kind of was very clear at that point. You could just basically watch the film in storyboard form, and then of course there were changes made, but it went very quickly. Actually, I think this is one of the shortest pre-production periods I ever had on a film. Of course, it took me 20 years to start making the film, but yeah.
Right, there's always that part.
There's that part.
You mentioned the music a little bit earlier. Can you talk a little bit about that and who created the music and how that helps propel the story?
The music was composed by a composer called Ruben de Gezelle, who composed 3 films of mine. And yeah, it's a great working relationship. We always start working on the music before actual production. So it's not like I make the film, present it to my composer, and then he composes the music. He actually composed the music on the storyboard, so on the animatic. And yes, it's a question of tweaking and rhythm, and when there's a zoom in, there's an accent. Whereas in a zoom out, there's an accent. So it was very intricate. I think we made 10 or 12 versions of the score. So yeah, really fun process.
And the sound design seems very intricate as well. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, that was done by Senjan Janssen is his name, and he's one of the, probably the most important sound designer in Belgium. He does a lot of feature films, a lot of, he's very, very well known. And of course, it was very challenging for him because the camera's moving past this accident, past these characters, it was a question of balance. How much do we push the dialogue? For example, if we pass a certain point, do we make it extremely realistic, or do we push it a little bit? Do we fake it a little bit so you can hear things? Do you hear entire sentences, or do you hear just the middle of a sentence, which then fades out? So all of these things were very, yeah, a lot of work went into the sound design. Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about that beautiful background that you created that it turns out is one huge image that takes 7 hours to render.
Yes.
The detail in it is amazing. What was your approach to designing that?
Well, it's a technique actually that I've used in all my films, but of course it has developed. And I basically paint on paper with acrylic paint and aqua paint. But I use a lot of sand to create texture, so that there's a lot of texture in all of the images, and even texture that I can't control. So it's muddy process. Like I don't want people coming into the room when I'm doing it, because there's paint everywhere, and it's just really kind of a messy way of working. But it creates a texture that I love. And once these paintings are made, these background paintings, they are scanned and then cut up into background, foreground, and animated. So a semi-digital way of doing it.
Very interesting. So it has the handcrafted approach married with technology.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about the character designs a little bit. They are very distinctive. Those eyes are so arresting. How did you arrive at this aesthetic?
I think the eyes are something that I've always been obsessed with in animated films. And I think because in my films, I don't like to overemphasize emotions on a face, like very happy, very sad. I don't like to do that. I like to keep it very subtle. And so the eyes help with that. It helps to have very expressive eyes, to let the audience project onto a character without actually having to overemphasize emotion in the character's face.
See, you did have something to say there.
Yes.
So I love how, the background is still, but there's so much emphasis on the movement within the film, like, with the bicycle wheels and other things that are moving. How did you achieve that, those sequences?
Actually, there is a lot of movement in the film, but most of the movement in the film is actually very easy to animate, because of course we had a small budget. We couldn't go, Pixar. We had to find other ways to make the image dynamic without using a lot of difficult animation. So a wheel that spins is very simple to animate. Feet that go like that are very simple to animate. A camera movement is quite simple to animate. Of course, it adds up, and then of course you have to render for 7 hours. But the animation in itself is actually quite simple. It's just a layering of very simple animation techniques. There aren't, like, the most difficult things in the film is a character stepping off a bike and walking somewhere and then stepping back on the bike. That's the most difficult animation, especially to do in Cutout, because you have the axis in depth. I don't which if it's Y, Z, or X. But, that's always very difficult to do in cutout animation. Cutout animation is left, right, up, and down, but you never go into depth. So that was difficult. But if you analyze it, actually the animation is quite simple. There's just a lot of it.
How do you deal with bringing cutout images forward and backward in space? You mentioned that was difficult.
Yes, it was just a question of scaling, like frame per frame scaling, making sure that the feet were, kind of visually locking the feet to a certain, let's say, brick or something, and then making sure that if he puts his second feet down, the one feet stays on the brick, and like a very unconventional way of animating, but it was the only way of doing it.
Oh, that's incredible. You mentioned that you mentioned your budget a little bit earlier. I know that's something all independent filmmakers struggle with. How were you able to secure funding for this project?
Well, we got funding from the Flemish Film Fund, and based on the animatic that I made. So the animatic was really the thing that sold the film, basically. No script. There was no script. There were, of course, graphic designs, but yeah, made the animatic, showed it to my producer. Producer went with this animatic to the Flemish Film Fund, and it got funded. So
that must have felt really great to get the green light on that. And
yes, yeah, of course, yeah. Yes.
Especially with the 20 years of thinking about it, and
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's true. First, I wanted to make. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I said first I had the idea to make it as a live action film. Like at a certain point in time, I wanted to make it as a live action film. But kind of
interesting.
That. Yeah.
And at what point did you feel that animation was definitely the way to tell the story?
Like I said, like this idea of this tension between animation and something realistic happening. There's like, for example, I don't know if you know the film Grave of the Fireflies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for example, that's a very realistic film, but it's in animation. And I saw an interview with the director Isao Takahata, and they asked him, why is it animation? And he said, well, we are so used to watching live action footage that we don't really look anymore. Like if you watch a film and there's a shot of a cloud, okay, that's a cloud. But in animation, you look more carefully at that cloud. It's because it's painted, it has graphical, it's a graphic thing. So you watch more carefully. And somehow I think that's kind of correct. I think, especially in realistic stories. I don't know. I'm just saying.
So you mentioned Isao Takahata. Are there other animation filmmakers you admire or you have felt yourself influenced by?
It's very difficult to say if I'm influenced by them, but I know, of course, what I like. And so I love the Studio Ghibli films, for example.
I'm sorry, which?
The Studio Ghibli films, like Miyazaki and Takahata and things like that. Really love those films. They have a poetic quality to them, and I really love the rhythms of their films. They're so unlike most animated films. Like in a Studio Ghibli film, you could see a character just standing and looking at a landscape. That never happens in most animated films. They always go by very quickly. A lot of things happen, which is fine, but it's just a different way of looking at it. And I love like more experimental things, I guess, like the Quay brothers and Norstein.
Let's talk a little bit about audiences. What are you hoping people will take away from seeing The Passerby?
I hope they love the experience of watching the film. I think it's a very I'm interested in making films that are aesthetic experiences, like they're an experience that I'm not really trying to make a point. That's something I'm not really interested in. It's the experience of watching the film. So I just hope that it evokes some kind of emotion.
Which is what cinema does for us.
Which is, yes.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah.
So you'd like to continue in that grand tradition. You know, sometimes, well, for instance, your film has screened at several festivals. Let's see, Annecy, SIGGRAPH, here we are at Spark. Where else?
Oh, there's actually the weeks that have passed have a lot of festivals have selected my film, but I don't know all of those names. There's the London International Animation Festival.
Oh, Encounters.
Encounters, yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
and so on. Yeah.
Is it strange this year to not be traveling with your film?
It's strange, yes. It's strange. Really weird. Also, of course, because you conceive the film for a big screen, especially this one. It's like a CinemaScope, and then it's these are weird times. What can I say? Let's hope it gets better soon.
And outside of the film's festival run, do you see a life for it, outside of the world of independent animation?
Ooh, I think that's a difficult question. I actually think it's more and more difficult to get a film to stretch the life of a film, if you will. Of course, there are festivals, but yes, I guess you can put it on YouTube. There's television. It has been shown on television, actually, in France.
Oh, terrific.
Those things. But I think YouTube has changed a lot of things. I think for filmmakers in general.
How so?
Both positive and negative. So of course you can put a film on YouTube, but at the same time it's very difficult. I think I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think it's more difficult than ever to find an audience, even though you can put your film on YouTube and things like that. I don't know.
And do you think this is one of the larger challenges that independent filmmakers are looking at today, independent animators?
Oh yeah, definitely, yes. Especially also if you're making a feature, for example, if you're making an animated feature is already, of course, a big deal. It's very difficult to make, for example, an animated feature, especially if it deviates somewhat from the mainstream. But then to find an audience is, I think, extremely difficult. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit pessimistic, I'm afraid, about the future of, let's say, independent cinema. Well,
it's been a long year, and it's been a long time since any of us have really been in the inside of a cinema. Yes. So I think we can all forgive you if you're feeling just a little bit pessimistic about that. The mood is kind of in the air. But at the same time, it's wonderful that there's this community and a very large international community and audience who are always interested in seeing what people have been working on, and that part must be very exciting.
Yes, of course. It's nice to also after each festival, I get mails from people. I saw your film at that festival, I loved it. So you know there's an audience, even though we don't see them now. Because, but yes, that's very. It helps. It helps because making an animated film is like it's a lot of work, and you have to be somewhat masochistic to make an animated film, and then to get a response from an audience is great. So sometimes maybe you can't worry about it. You just have to create. You just have to do it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Pieter, thank you so much for coming and speaking with me today. And for all of you watching along at home, I hope you're enjoying the rest of the programming Spark has put together. There's some incredible sessions. It's been a delight to be part of it. And Pieter, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.